Hey, it's David Lippman here. Today I'm going to give you a deeper dive, kind of an introduction and a primer to investment real estate. So sometimes if you haven't been involved in commercial real estate and investment property, and even if you have been involved, as you get into larger and larger properties, there can be some differences between residential and even the smaller properties. I would consider anything below 5, 6, 7, 8 unit multifamily or a small commercial property that's less than $2 or $3 million. They begin to operate a little bit differently than the larger properties do. So today we're going to begin thinking a little bit differently and get our minds around how investment properties work, the different terminologies that are involved, how lenders and or equity investors would look at those properties, because you as an advisor, you as a mortgage broker have a role here. You need to be aware, A, of how these properties work and how they operate, and you need to be able to advise your client, because sometimes clients don't always fully understand the details and the financials of how properties work. So this is the beginning of a three-part series. I think it's a three-part, might be other parts as we grow into it and see what's needed. But in the beginning, it's a shorter videos, 4, 5, 6 minutes, for a few different videos to walk you through and get you thinking about investment properties. We also have some financial models that are available, and I'm going to teach you and walk you through those financial models as well, and then we'll make those available to you so that you can use them on your own. So with that, let's jump in. The first thing we want to talk about when we think of investment properties, what kind of properties are involved. So I call this the investment property universe, all the different properties that fall into these categories. And you could just look at it very simply and say, well, it's everything that's not single family, right? If you're not living in the home, then it's everything else. But it really does have some characteristics to it, and we should begin to think about what's involved here. So let's first look at the different types of properties. And these are in no particular order, but the first five really do fall into what we call the five food groups. Multifamily, office, industrial or warehouse, retail, hotels, hospitality, lodging. Those are really the core five that have traditionally been known as commercial real estate as a whole. And nowadays we might just call them different things, but I still think of them as the five food groups. And then there are some additional ones that fall in here, which might be triple net lease. When you see an NNN, it stands for triple net lease. Land, mixed use properties, which is really any two combinations or more. Special purpose and self storage. So let's look at these a little bit in more detail, because they all have subcategories. Multifamily could be anything from 2 units and above, right? Obviously, it's 1 unit, it's a single family, but traditionally from the IRS code, 4 units or 1, 2, 3, and 4 unit properties are all considered single family, and they all fall under the same residential loans. That's why you can go to Fannie and Freddie and a regular residential lender, and they will also work with you on up to a 4 unit property. Once you get larger than those, then you're now talking about investment type properties, and they fall and they operate a little bit differently. Multifamily has a couple different types. You could think of garden style, which is typically your 1 to your 2 to maybe 3 story properties, as garden style. You can have mid-rise, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 unit properties, and then you could have high-rise properties when you think of larger, more skyscraper type of deals. Um, but also under multifamily would come student housing. And it could also be senior or assisted living housing. Although those typically run the gamut of, are they medical properties or are they their own characterization? In general, if somebody came to me, I would think that student housing and senior housing are all types of multifamilies where people are living. Next might be office. An office can run from a small medical office in your town where a couple doctors work out of, to a larger mid-rise office building, to very large office complexes. Industrial, these are your warehouses. This is your either a small warehouse to a larger warehouse. Retail, this could be your local strip center. It could be 3, 4, 5 different stores together. Could be a regional, what we call big box center, where you have your Home Depots and your Targets. Those are big box retailers. You could have very large entire complexes that are retail as well. Hotels and hospitality. This is everything again from your motels and your smaller, almost independently owned, to your chained, or what we say in the professional term would be your flagged hospitality. So what's a flag mean? It has a flag on it. It has a Marriott or a Hilton. Those are called flags. So hotels can also run in multiple different characteristics. And in all of these, there would be different levels. So you might say that there are hotels, and you could think of this. There are your, no offense to any hotel chain, there are your, let's say, more simple types of hotels, which you could think of as your the ones you find on the side of the highway when you're driving on a road trip. And then there are the fancier, more luxury hotels that you might find in the big cities. So they really do run in a widespread. Triple net lease. Triple net lease typically means that the tenant, the person renting, is going to be responsible for all of the rent, not the rent, all of the taxes, all of the utilities, and all the insurance. That's your triple, right? That's your triple trifecta. Your insurance, your taxes, and your utilities. And therefore, it's much less risk to the owner, to the landlord, right? If I'm not carrying the burden of any of those, what's my risk on the property? The only thing I'm responsible would be some structural and some structural components to the property and maybe the landscaping. But even that generally is covered by the tenants. So triple net lease is very much where I own the property, you pay for everything. Unlike every other type of real estate where the landlord, the owner of the property, is typically responsible for some degree of the utilities, some degree of the insurance, and some degree of the taxes, if not all of it. So triple net lease runs a little bit different. It's generally considered higher, a little bit higher risk because there's only one tenant. A factory might be triple net lease. And if that factory was to move out to a different location, you have no other tenants, you're just alone. Very often, triple net lease property would be your Walgreens and your CVS and your Rite Aids on the corner, right? Why? There's just one tenant in this building. Very often, CVS doesn't own the location, the building that it's in. Somebody else owns that building and they rent it on very long term, 30, 40, 50-year leases, if not longer, where they know they're going to stay there. Land, we all know what land is, but this could be raw land. This could be some kind of land that has been improved. Maybe somebody brought in the electricity or the pipes and the infrastructure already has it zoned. Land can follow multiple different levels of improvement. Every time somebody improves that land to some degree, it's still land, but it's improved land. And so you have to understand when somebody says, hey, I'm selling or I want to buy a piece of land, well, how improved is that land? Is it just completely raw dirt, or has there been some improvements to that? Mixed use. So mixed use is typically residential and some other component, but it's not necessarily. It might be you think of in a city like New York where you have 4 or 5 stories of apartment properties, and on the bottom level you might have a retail or a commercial store, usually a retail store. But that you've seen these properties around, and they're very common now when people like to have more of a lifestyle living, and this is a very popular component to the way we are living more and more, and the way properties are being built more and more today, where you have your life. You mean you don't have a commute, right? Because you live you live in the property, or you live in one area of the property, and in a different area of the property are your retail and maybe even your stores or your medical. All within one area. It becomes very convenient for people who don't want to have to drive long commutes. Um, I always had a presentation once recently where I saw an architect out of Germany actually was designing a skyscraper, and that skyscraper was intended to be a complete life cycle. Like you would never need to leave the building, no matter what your life. It had a component for younger families that were just starting out. It had a component, first 5 floors, next 10 floors were for people who had established families and or a certain lifestyle. Next was for retired people who were stepping down and needed a smaller apartment property. And on the bottom was not just the gym and the small hospital and medical facility. They had all of your shopping and all of your retail and all your grocery stores, all within this one building. In some bigger cities, you see some components of that, but this is just an extreme example of mixed use really being taken to the future and saying, in one building, in one complex, an entire family throughout the generations could all live and be completely cared for. Just an example of thinking a little bit outside of the box and the way different properties can expand and change over time. Special purpose, this could be anything. This is your school, this is your arena, this is your marina, this is your religious facility, whether it's a church or a synagogue or a mosque or whatever else it may be. This is everything the gas station, this is everything that falls into special use. Doesn't necessarily mean specialty. Like in Starport, we often like to think of ourselves as a marketplace for specialty mortgages. This is a little different. Certainly we are trying to capture everything that is special purpose, but specialty mortgage or specialty loan could also just mean a regular type of property, i.e. multifamily, but the borrower or the property has some unique characteristics to it where it needs a specialty mortgage. So not necessarily the same, but we should differentiate between a specialty mortgage to a special purpose asset or property type. And finally, there might be self-storage. We know what self-storage is, but it's grown into the fact that self-storage is now so common in many parts of the country and around the world that it really has its own designation. There are a few others that you could go in here and you could decide what are the top 10 and you move some in or out. But in general, these are a good broad category, and it's good to categorize within here. Regarding some of these considerations that we could think about, different asset types or different property types have different rental characteristics, and therefore they have a different risk profile. So for example, multifamily is typically considered the lowest risk. People are going to do a lot of things before they move out of their home. They will sell their car. They will do everything they can to find a new job before they move out of their apartment property. Um, and it's also that it's a locked in, typically 1 or 2 year lease. So the longer the lease, the more less risky the tenant profile, the more stable the property type. So multifamily being least risky to office to industrial, retail going up. Think of a hotel. A hotel essentially has to get an entirely new rental population every day. They have to re-rent their entire property nightly. So that's considered a very high risk. And so an apartment, a hotel is typically part real estate and part business, considered rather risky. So those are some things to think about. The people or the owner and operators of different properties tend to specialize in one type of asset or another type of asset. One group will own multiple different types of multifamily properties or multiple different types of office properties, and within that, they may even typically focus on only B-class office property. They're not doing the ultra high-end brand new. They're not doing the really run-down office. They like to be right in the middle. Different groups, different owner operators tend to specialize in a different type of asset and or characteristic within that asset. It's not a hard and firm rule. Certainly you'll find groups that like to diversify and maybe they pride themselves on the fact that they offer their investors a less risky profile because they diversify across multiple different asset types, but you do tend in general to find more of a specialty. Let's move on to the next slide. Some property characteristics. And what I mean by this is different strategies that go along with the property. So some property is going to be long term. I'm going to buy this apartment property and there's not much to do to it. It's in pretty good condition right now. Maybe I'll fix up the landscaping. Maybe I'll put a new paint on. But in general, I'm just buying it and I'm going to hold this for the long term. Fix to flip, or otherwise known as a value add property. I'm going to buy the property and my full intent is to improve it. Now I might improve it and then continue to hold on to it, and that's called what we call fixed to rent or fixed to long-term rent. Or I might say, no, I'm going to fix it up and then I plan to sell it very quickly. Typically, though, that as you get into larger properties, that typically takes a little bit of time. If you think of a single-family home, I could, in 30, 60 days, I could make improvements to the property and be ready to sell it. If you're doing a 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 unit multifamily property, what's going to take you some time to renovate each of those units and then put a new tenant in there, increase the rent with that new tenant, and then be ready to sell it. We call that maturing the rent roll. I'm going to make the renovations, and then I'm going to get a new tenant that's going to pay me a little bit higher rent because I've improved the property. And then once that new tenant's been in there for a few months, then my entire rent roll has gone up, all my income is higher, my property's going to be worth more, I'm ready to sell it. So we call it in single family fixed to flip or fixed to rent. In more commercial type properties, we might call them value add or even construction, significant rehab. If you're just making some cosmetic improvements, not just to the outside, but even to the units. Oh, we're going to improve the kitchen, we're going to improve the bathrooms, we're going to put some new flooring and maybe some new carpet and some new lighting fixtures. That's all considered cosmetic. If I have to go in and say, you know what, not only does it need new roof tiles, the roof has been destroyed and we have to put on an entirely new roof, or the windows are old and it's been leaking through the windows and we have to put in all new windows, or the plumbing is bad, some structural change to the property, that's already considered a rehab. Not a value add, but a rehab. So it just really depends on the level of difference. I know HUD would have some differences if you're spending more than 30% of the total value of the property on the renovations, that's already considered kind of a rehab. Don't quote me on these figures. I don't know exactly what the ratio is, but lenders will have a different designation. If you're spending more per unit than an X amount, they'll consider that a significant rehab, and that might require a different type of loan than just a cosmetic improvement. Um, So to your short-term rental. So this is a rather newer category in the last few years where your Airbnbs have come around. And so it's a long-term strategy. I'm going to buy the property for long-term. I intend to hold it for 10, 15 years as a rental property. But the style of rental or my strategy is to run it like a hotel, i.e. a short-term rental. It's a short-term rental, but not to get confused, the idea it might be a long-term ownership. Um, the borrowers in commercial properties are typically entities. We're generally not dealing with an individual. Matter of fact, I doubt the lenders would even lend to any kind of an individual on a commercial property. So typically you're looking at some kind of an entity, which is usually an LLC, unless you get into larger, different types of entities, for C, in a typical incorporated company, which is more common for a REIT, which is more of a public type of company. And then collateral is typically non-recourse, but it could also be recourse. And we're going to go over this in part two of this series. But in general, properties that are commercial properties that are for rental and don't have much renovation are going to be non-recourse, meaning the lender can only go after the property. If something was to go wrong with the loan, they could not go to the borrower. They could only go to the property and look to get recourse from the property. However, when you're dealing with substantial rehab and or construction, that's going to be very much recourse, or at least partial recourse. And as the property is improved, maybe the recourse might burn off. That's a term we'll often use. Yeah, it's full recourse at the beginning, but as you improve the property, there'll be partial recourse, partial burn off of the recourse, we might say. So let's look at some additional things to consider when evaluating a new loan request. So when somebody comes to you and they have a deal and they want you to be the mortgage broker on it, you need to think through that before you want to just jump in and say, okay, because you want to make sure that this borrower has their ducks in a row, let's say, has thought through the entire project and that it's going to make a lot of sense. Obviously, on smaller projects, this is less concerning. On larger projects, you want to make sure that you're dealing with a more professional organization. If you're dealing with a borrower who is growing from 1 or 2 unit properties or 1 or 2 unit multifamily, let's think, and now wants to buy a 7, 8, 9, 10, 15 unit property, you might want to guide them through and at least make sure that they're thinking of all these things because the lenders are going to want to know that. And so it's important that you understand and think like a lender before you take on a project that may or may not be financeable. So let's break this down. Let's first look at the property. And within a property, you're going to want to know, when was the property built? Has it been renovated at all since then? And what aspects have it been renovated? Again, properties have a useful life, right? How long does the flooring in an apartment property last? How long does the HVAC or the air conditioning systems last? They only last a certain number of years. So if this person's buying a property that was built 10, 15 years ago, let's even make that smaller, 7 or 8 years, you know, well, hey, that's when the air conditioning systems begin to run out. Or that's certainly when new flooring might be needed. Has this property been renovated? What's the condition of the property? Again, it could be any age, but has this property been well cared for? Has the previous or current owner taken good care of the property? Or have they let it run into the ground? Building materials, what was the building made out of? As you get more familiar with different types of property, you can almost recognize when the property was made just by looking at the building materials that were involved. Sometimes a coat of paint can hide things that are hidden underneath. So you want to make sure that borrowers thought these things through. Environmental concerns, these are called, typically when you're dealing with an investment property, you're going to need to get a phase 1 and or a phase 2 environmental study. Common third parties, you get an appraisal, you get a proper condition report, almost like an engineering report, and you get a phase 1 to make sure there's no environmental concerns. You'd be surprised, especially deal with properties in older parts of the country, i.e. the Northeast. You are dealing with properties that, who knows, 100 years ago, there was a garbage dump or there was an old gas station on the facility. You don't know. So you typically have to get a phase 1 study done. And ingress and egress about the property. You want to make sure that people can get into the property easily and can get out of the property easily. What's the parking like? Do they have enough parking spots? What's the zoning going to require regarding parking? So you want to take all these things into consideration. Market location. Does this property have access to transportation, right? Very often you either want to be near trains, near large roadways, highways, so you can get to the big cities for jobs rather quickly. That's all what we mean by access to transportation. Lifestyle amenities. Are there movie theaters and retail and restaurants nearby so that people want to live in this area without having to drive an hour and a half to get to the nearest grocery store? And that's all really adds value to a particular location. Is the property in the path of development? For example, you can see where properties are being gentrified if it's an older area where other investors are making improvements to the property. And This property's still in a rundown area, but you can see that it's in the path of improvement. That's a nice opportunity. You can buy less for a lower valuation now with the realization that the path of development is coming in your direction. In comps, you want to get a very good understanding, and this will be an entirely different video, just how to evaluate the competitive properties to this property. No property exists in a vacuum. Nobody has a monopoly. There are always other competitive properties, and you have to know how to evaluate those different competitive properties. Certainly, you want to make sure that the borrower has done their job at evaluating the different competitive properties. You want to take a look at the borrower, both the entity and the individual. So, do they have direct experience with this property type? What's their PFS look like? Their personal financial statement. Do they have the net worth to handle a loan of this magnitude? Are they going to, first of all, have the down payment? And if they're not going to, how are they going to be raising equity? Credit history and the business operations. How are they going to run this property? Are they going to have third-party management? Do they have their own accounting and their own facility, their bookkeeping, whatever facilities they're going to need to be able to invoice all the tenants each month and make sure that the AR and the AP are collected on time? How are they going to handle all that? Some smaller organizations have all of that organized. Some do not. You just want to be aware of the borrower, and you might want to help the borrower and advise them, hey, listen, you're buying a bigger property for the first time right now. You should think of this. You should think of getting a more sophisticated bookkeeper and some software to help you with that. On the top of the next column now, I'm going to look at property financials. So this is no longer the borrower. Remember, on an investment property, the loans are generally non-recourse, which means the borrowers care less. Not that they don't care about, but they care less about the borrower because they don't expect to be able to go after the borrower's finances. They care more about the property's financials because this is their only recourse. So they're going to want to do a deeper dive on the income. They're going to want to evaluate every aspect of that income. Think of a multifamily property. They're going to see a copy of every lease. If you've got 10 units, they want to see all 10 leases. Um, Same thing with expenses. They want to do a detailed breakdown of all the expenses. And finally, you want to make sure that this borrower, if they're going to be raising equity, does this property support an equity investment? And even if they're not raising outside equity, for they themselves, does this property make sense? That after they pay off their mortgage, they're going to have money left over, that the property makes sense as a good investment. Because if they're not going to be able to make a living from this individual property, well, then how are they making a living? Meaning, smaller properties don't throw off enough income for any one individual to support themselves. So how are they making a living? And even within this one investment, you want to have a good understanding of what kind of investment returns this property is throwing off so that it looks like it's a worthwhile opportunity for this borrower. You don't want them to become involved with a property that they're making no money on, and they get disinterested, and that's going to create problems. And finally, what is the business plan and opportunity here? What does this borrower plan to do to the property? Again, it could be, again, this goes back to the previous slide we were talking about strategy. If it's just, I'm going to hold it long term, okay, well, do you expect to be able to increase rents? How are you going to manage rental increases with expense increases? If taxes are going up in this municipality faster than they have been in the past, are you going to be able to raise rents to cover that? And you want to help the borrower think through that. You can do some research within the municipality and try to get a feeling for how have taxes been going up, how has property insurance been going up in this area, and other utility costs have been going up in this area. So you want to think through all that and make sure that the borrower's been thinking through their business plan. Certainly, if they plan to renovate and make improvements, that's one thing. What's their budget? What kind of improvements are they making to the property? Why those improvements over others? And then they're probably going to tell you, well, we expect to be able to raise the rents as well. Okay, how do you know that? Show me the property comps in the area of, let's say, properties that have been renovated more recently that have higher rents. So your rent is at, I don't know, $100 a month, and their rent is at $150 a month because they've renovated their property last year, or better yet, it was built more recently. Well, there's your potential improvement level. But you want to make sure that you've done your homework and looked at those rental comps and really compared apples to apples, so that when you improve this property, you're confident you can gain those increases. Who else is involved in this property? If there's going to be a renovation, who's doing the renovation? Is there a contractor? What's the reputation of that contractor? Do you have cost estimates in writing from that contractor? Do they have the right skills needed? Does this borrower have the right skills to manage outside contractors or outside designers, whatever they may need? Or if they plan to do a lot of the work themselves, do they have those skills? And finally, have they planned for a loan financing plan that they're putting together? What's if they're going to be expected to take this as a bridge loan, and then, for example, in 12, 30, or 12, 24, 36 months, they're planning to get another loan. Have you looked at what they expect rates to be in that time period, and how much they intend to be able to improve the property's NOI between now and then? And then finally, you want to make sure they're thinking through source and uses. Uh, where are they getting the money? From a loan, from their own equity? That's your uses. I mean, that's your sources of capital. And then how are they using the money? Buying the property, closing costs, any kind of renovation budget, even a small one. You want to make sure they have their sources and uses balanced out. So those are a few of the things to consider when evaluating a new loan request. I know it seems like a lot, but it really does make a lot of sense if you just break down these larger categories: property, market, the borrower, the property financials, and then the general business plan. Within that, you could go into an endless breakdown, but in general, you could just have a quick conversation with your borrower to make sure they've thought these things through, because this will form the basis of putting some kind of a business plan together, whether they're going out to investors or even to a lender. Starport's certainly going to be able to help you with this, but the lenders are going to eventually come to the borrower and want to see more detailed information than what you're going to provide on Starport in the beginning to get a soft quote. You want to prepare your borrower so that when that lender comes to them and wants to see more detailed information, that your borrower already has that prepared. In the next video, we will take a deeper dive into some of the terms and terminology that we use in investment property. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll speak to you soon. Thank you.